And we are back on the Zero Hour. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and ever since they first laid rails and started running trains, kids have dreamed of joining the railroad. And a lot of Americans, people around the world, may have one idea about what it's like to work trains nowadays and what's going on in the world of a train worker. But here to enlighten all of us is our next guest. Ron Kaminkow is General Secretary of the group Railroad Workers United, which is a cross-craft network of railroad workers from all crafts carriers and rail unions across North America. Ron is also currently working as a locomotive engineer on an Amtrak passenger service, and he's worked as an engineer, brakeman, conductor on a number of different railroad lines. He's here with us now to talk about some of their latest issues and struggles. Ron, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me, RJ.
You bet. Now, listen, first, did I pronounce your last name right?
It's Kaminkow.
Kaminkow. Okay. All right. Thank you for the correction. Mine is Eskow. You'd be amazed how many people get it wrong. Eskow. It's phonetic, but they get it wrong. So I'm glad I asked. Kaminkow. Ron Kaminkow. And listen, Ron, so you guys, I've been reading up on you guys, Railroad Workers United, and what struck me first, and I've been reading your official publication, the Highball, and you got a couple big fights, but one of the biggest fights I think you guys are working on now is this idea of the single employee train crew, and this seems to be a big and ongoing battle for you. Is that right? And if so, could you tell us a little bit about it?
That's right. We've actually been engaged in this fight for almost getting on a decade now. It was in November of 2004 that the major rail carriers in the United States basically played their hand and made it very clear that they intended to run trains with a single employee. As little as a few generations ago, train crews typically were 5 and even 6 crew members. That was pared down through the implementation of new technology, the elimination of the caboose in the 1980s and so forth, until the 90s when we were basically left with just the engineer and the conductor as the 2 employees on through freight. And then, like I say, in the fall of 2004, the rail carriers decided, well, we're going to push in contract negotiations to eliminate one of those positions and then just simply have trains run with 1 employee. And so at that time, in the spring of 2005, a group called Railroad Operating Crafts United got started. Our goal was to unite the conductors union and the engineers union to make it impossible for the rail carriers to play one union and one craft off against the other. That organization morphed into RWU in 2008, and this has been one of our pet projects ever since our origin.
So you're still fighting this battle now. Are they talking about doing this for all kinds of trains, passenger as well as freight?
It remains to be seen. I think the ultimate goal of the rail industry would be to run trains with absolutely nobody on board. And they believe that this would be quite possible through what's known as positive train control, satellite operation of trains, and so forth. As you're aware, in the rail industry, we once had 2 million employees, and that is pared down to under 200,000 today. We're actually moving a lot more tonnage than we ever have with far fewer employees. In fact, U.S. railroaders are known as the most efficient railroaders on the face of the planet in terms of what they call I believe the expression is man-ton miles, which is to say an employee moves a ton of freight a mile most efficiently in terms of less labor power. And of course the carriers are going for less. It remains to be seen. Now, if you like, I'll talk about the tentative agreement in the context of the Burlington Northern Santa Fe and the SMART Union, which is kind of...
Sure, tell us about that.
Okay, the reason I want to switch over to that is because the BNSF, which is owned by Warren Buffett, it's a Berkshire Hathaway company. About 5 or 6 years ago, Berkshire Hathaway bought out the Burlington Northern Santa Fe, the second largest freight railroad in the United States. They bought it out in its entirety, and they are the railroad that seems to be spearheading the drive for single-employee train crews. Now, when pressed, their PR frontman will say, oh, no, we're not going to operate oil trains with a single employee, because they know there'd be a huge public outcry. But in the tentative contract agreement with the union that we are dead set opposed to, nowhere in that tentative agreement does it say anything about accepting oil trains, passenger trains, other trains laden with toxic materials, hazardous material. There's nothing in the contract. So our assumption is once the whole thing blows over, if in fact BNSF ever is allowed to commence running trains with a single employee, if there's no federal regulation and no federal law and no union contract that prohibit it, then they would probably, in all likelihood, begin to run oil trains and everything else with a single employee.
You know what else strikes me about that deal is that, or about that issue, is that if they're saying that, if they're even claiming that they wouldn't run those trains with hazardous materials on them, aren't they acknowledging that it's dangerous to run a train with only one employee on it?
You would have to ask them that question. Our take is that it is extremely dangerous to run these trains, to run any train with a single employee. There has been made some mention of the fact that Amtrak and some commuter railroads operate with a single engineer in the cab of a locomotive. And while this may be true, that engineer has a conductor and an assistant conductor to provide effective support as the train goes down the track, reminding the engineer of impending speed restrictions or other hazards that may come along the right of way. If there is any kind of emergency, if the train were to have an encounter at a railroad grade crossing with a truck or a car, a pedestrian, and a fatality or injury were to result, that engineer has two qualified and certified co-workers to resort to. On freight trains, the proposal is to have none of this. The engineer would be completely on his own or her own. Trains traverse territory that is often very, very remote and skirts the edges of wilderness areas in places like Colorado and Montana. Remote canyons, goes through long tunnels over high trestles in very, very remote locations. And if and when any kind of derailment, crossing, collision were to occur, or any other type of medical emergency, there would be nobody potentially for miles and miles to lend assistance. That's just the tip of the iceberg. Written articles recently explaining dozens and dozens of similar hazards that would result if we simply ran trains with a single employee crew. For example, railroad workers are generally on call. We have no set schedules in the freight industry. Railroad workers by law can be forced to work up to 12 hours at a time. This is incredibly routine for workers to work at night, through the night, 12 hours. Imagine with no assistance every day, day after day, week after week. One day you're up all night, then you sleep in the daytime. We go to work at all kinds of hours. You never know when that phone's going to ring. You never know when you're going to work. You don't know when you'll arrive at your away-from-home terminal. You have no idea how long you'll be at the away-from-home terminal, and you have no idea when you're going to be called to come home and how long that tour of duty will last.
And now they're telling you to spend those extended hours in basically complete human isolation.
Yeah, absolutely. And that brings us to other hazards. Just the sheer fact of, in general, railroaders historically work for the railroad throughout their career. We have lots of guys who have worked for the railroad for 20, 30, 40 years. If that's going to continue, I can't imagine the young generation spending their entire working life in total isolation in a locomotive cab, which is about, I've never measured one, but it's probably about 10 by 10 feet. About the size of an old, cheap, single-room occupancy hotel room. You're in a very small quarters. You're isolated from just about everybody, and this is how you would spend your career year after year, decade after decade. I don't believe that's a good way for anybody to go to work.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. And we're going to have to leave it there for now. But where can people go to find out more about the work you guys are doing?
Probably the easiest way would be to go to our website. It's www.railroadworkersunited.org. And at that website, you can make contact with us. You can join the organization. You can basically peruse all of the information. We have a series of different campaigns we're involved in, including this one, with lots and lots and lots of documentation. Right now on our homepage is all of the information about what's going on the BNSF right now.
Okay, well, we encourage people to do that. The railroads affect us all, and thank you so much for joining us, Ron Kaminkow, current General Secretary of the group Railroad Workers United. You guys do great work, and thanks for joining us.
All right, thank you. I appreciate you having us on.
You bet.